Welcome back to Second Breakfast, and welcome back to our Devouring Dune series. We have been diving headfirst into the world of Arrakis. We did an episode on the first Dune movie when it originally came out, but in anticipation of the new movie, I have been blowing through these books. So we covered the first Dune novel in 3 parts, as it's divided into 3 sections. We did an episode about Dune Messiah just recently, and now we're back to talk about the next full-length Dune novel, Children of Dune.
I love that this just happened like accidentally. I think if we had like sat down and said, hey, what if we covered like all the Dune books and the movies and just like did all that all for the month of March, I would have been like, no, I don't want to. We got other things to do. But then this just kind of happened, and it's been very, very fun.
It's organic. We also did a 90-minute spectacular about the new movie. I forgot to mention that.
That was like one of the longest episodes we've ever done.
It was so much fun.
It was really, really
Loved
fun.
it.
Yeah, go check that out if you haven't.
So Children of Dune is long. Messiah was shorter. It was about the length of one of the parts of the original book. So that was pretty normal to do that in one episode.
Yeah.
This book's long.
How long is it?
It's not quite as long as the original Dune, but it's, over 600 pages.
Wow.
So we're doing this as one episode. I read the whole thing. I've enjoyed it. I had more of a journey with this one than I think I did with the others. But that sort of texture and challenge was, in the end, maybe more rewarding. So
awesome. And for context, I've read a little bit of the first book, and I've seen the movies. So we're not going to spoil anything beyond the second movie. Yes?
Yes. And I've tried to organize my thoughts so I'm not spoiling Maggie, and I'm not spoiling you at home. I'm going to talk about some ideas and similarities to things, but I'm not going to name any specific characters when I talk about those ideas.
Cool.
So you should still be fine going into this book. I don't want to ruin the experience.
I don't envy what you had to do to get these notes together.
Incredibly difficult, but also, again, a fun challenge. This has felt so organic doing this series, and I'm getting a lot out of it, so I hope you guys are as well. Let's jump into it.
Great.
Children of Dune. We're brought to you today by Patreon as well. Let's do that up front. $2 a month, support the show, get a bonus episode, 2 years of bonus episodes piled up back there. We do one a month. We've been doing more than one a month lately just because inspiration keeps striking.
What are we doing this month, Cam?
This month, we are doing the David Lynch 1984 Dune movie.
That's
just
right.
to, variations on a theme. And by the time this is out for the month of March, we will have also done one about the state of reading.
Oh, that's
the
right.
act of reading in 2024. All of the permutations and choices and compromises.
Formats.
That the various formats demand of you. That's a fun conversation. So those are both up over on Patreon by the time this comes out.
Awesome.
All right. That's the rigmarole. Let's jump into the episode.
Let's do it.
So yeah, I want to start with sort of the difficulty I had with this one, because I devoured the previous 2 books, and this one took me a little more time to settle into. I was worried that it had lost some of the magic. I was reading this one on the Kindle, so I had that weird percentage of how far I am in the book, which is kind of weird to me, but it wasn't until like 15% of the way through the book that everything lit up. And then the rest of the novel felt like a sprint to me. It was all great, and I was like locked in for the rest of the novel. But the finale, I will say, the finale had like one little callback. Because there's a character who's sort of your POV for the first chapter.
Okay.
Who it doesn't usually get that tight a narrative focus. And there's one little like line of a thought in his head during the finale that pulls you right back to the opening scene. And that kind of made it all make sense for me.
Okay.
I think it made that slower opening hit harder. But like the other books, there's some funny business going on at the beginning of this book. We have a lot of new characters. And that's okay. I love the way Herbert introduces new characters. I'm less resistant to new people with him than I am in every other series.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that you have been so open to that, because normally you really don't like it.
And there's also another big time jump. Another big one.
That seems to be the theme here, is that we're just skipping through a long periods of time.
Yeah.
Is it a spoiler to tell me how much time has passed?
No, I don't think so. So within the first book, there is a 2-year time jump. Then there's a 9-year time jump going into Messiah.
Right.
And then I think it's 12 years here.
Okay, wow.
So, I mean, it's not crazy. The next book's going to have, I think, thousands of years as a time jump. But this one had 12.
Okay.
But Frank Herbert buried some of the cool updates and like cast reshufflings. They weren't signposted early enough on to get you really excited with the new shape of things. He slow rolled some of those revelations. And that's okay in retrospect, but in the moment, I wasn't nearly as hyped as I could have been.
Oh, that's
early
frustrating.
On.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
again, like 15% of the way through, the whole thing lit up and I was hyped through the end of the book.
Okay, great.
I tried to pepper some quotes, and I've been really trying to do that during these discussions just to anchor these conversations within the text. And some of the quotes that I highlighted while I was reading were just phrases that spoke to me. They spoke to a larger theme. They reminded me of something you and I have been talking about. And that's the first one I want to play with. The quote is, "Old men of the desert."
Okay.
And in context, that's one of the ways that they refer to Shai-Hulud, the sandworms, is being like an old man of the desert.
Oh, yeah,
But
okay.
in plural here, old men of the desert, yes, it could refer to worms, but I'm thinking I'm thinking of it more here as cycles of characters, returning characters, aging characters. There's a historical lens to almost everything.
Well, and there's
in
like
this series.
there's an implied like wisdom and knowledge to that phrase, I think. So
Yes,
that's
there
sort of
is.
in line with what you're thinking.
And that wisdom comes from a historical perspective and using that lens to see patterns, to see graduations and changes. And that was my feeling kind of cascading throughout the experience of reading this novel. Children of Dune, for me, feels like a full cyclical moment for the series. Obviously, it's not the end. There are 6 books from Herbert, and then he died before he could write the 7th one, which was later kind of written in 2 parts by his... Anyway,
Okay.
things go on. But
Okay.
there's not like one definitive ending, which almost serves this purpose. That things are cyclical and eternal. But Children of Dune felt like an experiment where we're moving with a thicker time jump than we've had so far. We're lurching into the next generation. There are some brutal kind of pivots and callbacks throughout that have fun there. One example I wanted to spotlight is you get, and I'm obscuring names here, so I'm not spoiling you,
I
but there is
appreciate
a plot line where a reluctant Atreides is thrust into a grand role, but this time, as opposed to the original book or even Messiah,
Sure.
that character is not haunted by the future and visions of possible futures. Now it's the past. And the way they do that, I can't spoil, but it's more literal and funky and almost magical than whatever you're expecting.
Okay.
It's a unique way, it's a fresh, new way of tracing these patterns across time. The way I was talking about that historical lens. It's not like Herbert is just banging on about that one point for books and books and books in the same way. It felt remarkably fresh here to have
Okay.
someone haunted by the past. And I think it's a new way to stage this fresh sequence of history as we move on to a new generation.
Okay. That sounds pretty cool.
It is. And it's more tricky and more rewarding than I'm saying. I just don't want to ruin
Yeah.
some of the reveals here.
I appreciate that. But I'm glad that it's not just like him hammering the same points home over and over
No,
again.
no.
That would obviously get very dull.
No, and there's nothing dull. I
Cool.
didn't find anything dull here. Even like there's a lot of information here about sort of how sandworms come to be and that they started these little sand trouts and they have to be they have to grow up alone or they'll eat and kill each other. The movie kind of referenced this a little bit.
yeah, it did. Yeah.
There's a lot about sand trout in this book,
Okay, cool.
but it's never boring.
Nice.
You know why, Maggie?
Why, Cam?
Because sandworms are cool.
They are very,
And you
very
never
cool.
resent learning more about them.
Well, you know what's also cool about this is like I feel like this, because we're covering so much time and adding so many new characters, it seems like with every single book, like just kind of bouncing around, or it could feel like it's bouncing around. Like I feel like what could have happened here is Frank Herbert is like, okay, I've created this really cool world, this cool universe. Now I'm just going to play around in it and do different stories, bopping around different places, the way that like all the Star Wars shows are doing now, right? Like, and sometimes they're doing them well, like with The Mandalorian, but then they're also doing like Ahsoka, whatever. And then Obi-Wan and all these other names, I don't know.
Boba Fett.
But yeah, I can't even talk about Boba Fett. But it's like, they realize their story is over. So like, oh shit, what do we do? We can't tell the same Skywalker story again. So I guess we'll just bop around and spend way too much time on Tatooine, or just bop around and spend time on the ice planet or wherever. I don't
Hoth.
know. Sure. Like, but, and sometimes obviously the themes overlap. It's not just like random stories, but they often feel like it's just creators getting a chance to play in the sandbox and do what they want to do, which is fun in its own way, but that can feel tedious and like, what's the point of this?
Derivative.
Why are we doing this? Exactly. It seems like what Frank Herbert is doing is interacting with, playing with those same themes and ideas and carrying his stories from one, section of the timeline to the next, in a unique way that doesn't that's both fresh but also feels like it belongs.
And
so
it's
that's nice.
This story is not over yet. We're not just piddling around on Tatooine. We still have a lot of our returning characters. We have, I mean, obviously from the title of the book, we have descendants of some of our original characters.
Yes.
And then you can make interesting dynastic points or observations as you see things ripple and reflect through time.
Yeah.
And talking about that as a sequence of history and the continuing progression of that sequence of history, I talked a lot about the Shakespeare histories in the previous episodes. I've got no Shakespeare for this one because I think Herbert is fully moved beyond that. I'm not saying he was influenced or like referencing it explicitly originally, but I think you could graft it more easily onto that as a framework. Here, I think he's very much moving past Shakespeare. He has a different interest. It's not just the historical lens. It's what I want to call the meddlers.
Okay.
Because he's got these characters like Paul with the prophecies and more power and more control over bringing certain futures to pass. These characters become these insidious tinkerers on a higher level.
Like Game of Thrones style?
No, more than that. It's
okay.
almost theological, right? Where you can control and shape future histories.
Nice.
And talking about like the phrase in the book a lot is the golden path.
Oh, okay. I mean,
And
in the way
Paul
like
references that in the movie.
okay, is it like in the way that like the Bene Gesserit have been trying to influence and scheme in the first book?
Yes, yeah, exactly. You're working with the lens of hundreds of years and trying to architect and play God over this future.
Very cool. That's fun.
More of that is happening here, and I have a couple quotes that I thought exemplified that. This is from one of the meddlers' perspective, and I cut out that like right at the beginning of this quote would be a spoiler for who it is, so I had to abridge it just a little bit.
You're incredible. I love it.
But this is from dialogue. The person is saying, "To know the future absolutely is to..."
You got it. Reverse.
To know the future absolutely is to be trapped into that future absolutely. It collapses time. Present becomes future. I require more freedom than that.
Cool.
So you see how there is this villainous undertone that I think Herbert's point is inherent in this meddling. It's inherent to this desire to control and shape the future. Is something villainous. There is a hunger and a greed for a power that you're not going to give up easily.
Sure, yeah.
And you see that perspective that I require more freedom than that. It escalates in some of these meddlers through the course of this book to this monstrous degree, to the point that you have characters, the same character, later on saying something like, quote, "The entire universe with all of its time is within me."
Oh, jeez. Nice.
So you're dealing with like dictators and despots on a level not possible within our world, but even not really imagined in worlds like Game of Thrones or any of the other genre fiction you want to point a stick at.
It doesn't usually escalate to such a theological level.
Right. Yeah. Which is almost the grandest level we can imagine.
Right. Well, it's interesting that the next book is called God, Emperor of Dune.
Oh, yes, indeed.
So, okay, this is cool.
And similarly, the way this idea was introduced with Paul in the original books, with his kind of early prophecy meddling, you see some of that on screen in the first two movies.
Certainly.
There is this, after he drinks the water of life, you see this change in his temperament, in his attitude. He's much more vicious. Even with the people around him who he should love and value, he's much more vicious. And
Certainly,
I think that's very much in the book. That was a great translation on screen. But what that speaks to is a dehumanizing effect that comes from this meddling. And I think Herbert's point is that effect, that dehumanizing effect, compounds over time.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a corrosion of humanity that becomes almost literal here. If we're talking about this is the third book in a series where he's talking about the same ideas, I think he's more and more explicit about those ideas. So he's making that dehumanizing point almost literally here. He's without spoiling it, he's drifting into some like Frankenstein stuff.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Through the course of this book. There's this recurring line that I saw on the Kindle. I just kept highlighting the line. It was in there like 4 times. But the context of it evolves and sours and shifts.
I love when that happens in a book. It's so fun.
Yes, and it feels like a warning.
Yeah.
Every time. It's like this omen. You feel like your ears stand up. it becomes increasingly literal, this recurring line calling one of those grand meddling characters no longer human. While we watch them have this terrible success, we see their growing power, and that's more and more ominous to us. It builds this feeling that I really tried to scratch at in assembling these notes. It builds this terrible feeling of dread and cosmic, because we're on such a large stage here with these ideas of leadership. It is so expansive and timeless. It builds this feeling of cosmic inevitability. So instead of just discussing religion, like we did in the first book, we have the Fremen as almost these objects of interest at first. We have this idea of religious fanaticism. We have Muad'Dib and the introduction of the Messiah and the Prophet. We're sort of slow rolling some of these religious concepts. Instead of almost an academic perspective on a lot of those issues, we're now seeing that evolution, that sort of spiral firsthand in real time. The character who becomes the god Emperor of Dune, I know who that is going to be based on the ending of this book. It's not a spoiler. That character is not a prophet anymore, not a hero, not a messiah even, but a true god.
Wow, okay.
That is the explicit escalation from what we were playing with in the first two books. It means that we are getting a more direct and I think rewarding navigation of the religious concepts in this world, but also this much more damning attack on power. And authority figures, those who wish to rule, all the way down to the lowest schemers and meddlers.
Sure. I mean, well, it implies such a direct linear path, explaining how this kind of thing happens. You start with something like Paul, and then it escalates and escalates, and all of a sudden, it's sort of implying that all power, that simple message that all power corrupts, and it can become, and often, or maybe inevitably becomes, this dangerous and impossible to contain. And it's very, very scary.
And you're chasing it. Herbert is almost chasing that idea past its logical conclusion to this almost irrational,
supernatural,
inconceivable excess. And that makes the commentary, that makes the condemnation that much stronger.
Well, and it makes the condemnation of organized religion stronger as well, which is not often what you see when you're having a story about the corruptive nature of power. It doesn't usually also extend to religion.
Right.
So that's cool.
Right. I mean, the crass, I guess, way of saying it's ballsy. It's an increasingly ballsy commentary that he's offering here. But again, it is always narrative. It is never a lecture.
Nice.
Everything is character focused here.
Love that.
Even when characters are philosophizing, it's against the backdrop of a fascinating interaction, full of emotion and plots and schemes and feints. It's always narrative.
Cool.
And maybe that's the most important compliment to give him, is that somehow he roots all of this, which I would read as a philosophy textbook because I've got a degree in it. I would read that anyway.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's always this amazing story is what makes this such a celebration for me to see this executed so well on a storytelling level.
That's amazing.
At one point, there's a character who says, "Thus we all play God." And I think that is sort of pinpricking these ideas, bringing them to the surface. That hits harder when you're talking about a God figure. Instead of just the little fingers, the Varys sort of characters.
The child's play version of playing God. This is oh no, this is somebody actually playing God.
Yeah, because you see that character zoomed out as far as the Bene Gesserit, as far as anyone could, to see the expanse and almost totality of history and time, to make these little recalibrations, to see how past people tried to control the universe, and make these little bitty adjustments to try to tip the scales, to try to push things further, to test new boundaries. And it's more and more insidious and creeping to learn from those past despots and rulers. We're almost approaching fourth wall territory by the end of the book with the amount of power, the amount of control and perspective this future God Emperor has.
Wow.
And I don't know what that means for the next book, but I'm very excited.
Okay, cool, yeah.
Because I love that escalation that I tried to highlight there. There's that really poignant line about a hero in the first book. And you go into prophet as the name of the third book in the first book. And then
Third book of Dune, the novel. Yeah.
And then the second novel is called Messiah.
Yes.
And then here you have the rising of a god character. And then the next book doubles down on that with God Emperor.
Right. Yeah. So how much farther can it go?
Right. And I don't know. And that's maybe the most exciting prospect here. But I wanna sort of break down a claim that's implicit in a lot of the things I've said so far and spend some time on it directly. My claim is basically that Children of Dune is a 600-page distillation echo of everything that came before. Everything. But
wow.
Mostly, I mean, Messiah, it's more in attitude, where you're doing more of the politicking, the intrigue, the philosophy. I've talked about that. Let's spend a little time with a 10,000-foot view of the echoes of the first book.
Oh, cool. That's going to be fun.
Plot and architecture. And I'm going to tell you all of these things, and I've tried to obscure particulars, all of these things happen again in Children of Dune.
Wow, okay.
There's great calamity on the horizon, drama between the major and minor houses, dormant and eventually operatic betrayals within those houses, new regimes that feel doomed from the first second you meet them, red flag youngsters coming of age,
sure,
the breaking and scattering of sacred fellowships, a new version of the rivalry with the Baron that we saw in the first book, new tests and coronations within the Bene Gesserit, new scenes of characters being immersed and integrating themselves within the Fremen. A new version of the sandworm riding initiation sequence. New calamitous imperial royal visits, and even certain key deaths.
Oh, wow.
Explicitly restaged and tweaked a little.
Cool.
And maybe the first concern, I was trying to look at this from your perspective when I was putting these together,
is it just
that sucks, right?
Is it just a repeat? Is it the same thing with new characters?
I already read that book. I already watched those movies.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to immediately clarify that despite those numerous echoes, Children of Dune never feels predictable.
Wow, that's impressive.
There's a phrase that I highlighted when I was reading, a beautifully empty canvas. And even when these familiar plot beats are tracked onto that beautifully empty canvas, it never feels like, oh, I know exactly what this picture is going to look like when it's done.
Well, that's interesting because, I mean, when we were talking about your last point about the escalation of power and that sort of linearity, that does feel so predictable. Like, what do we think is going to happen once the prophet becomes the Messiah, once the Messiah becomes the God? Like, wonder what on earth could happen. So it's interesting that it doesn't actually feel predictable.
And I think there are a couple things to credit for that fresh feeling continuously through the book. Herbert deploys some things I wish I could spoil, these sort of ingenious and efficient monkey wrenches. One example, an Atreides attempts to kill another Atreides in the same way a Harkonnen once attempted to kill a Harkonnen.
Okay.
So you have that cross-pollination. You're making a point there, as well as staging something
that makes a point about the Atreides and Harkonnen similarities and family tree connections, but also is playing.
It's cool.
It's cool, yeah.
Yeah, it's dramatically interesting to watch, and I think those sort of twists pay dividends. It refreshes the story and complicates some of the commentary. It means that you're sort of crossing battle lines here and expanding who's implicated within this critique. Herbert is, I think, particularly in this third book, methodically dismantling the idea of innocence within a royal court any great house. I think he's sculpting and recreating this, another quote from the book, the fallacy of power. And he's doing it slowly while casting a wider net. And I think it's one overall critique. He's building this one big, knotted, twisted tyranny. It's not simple battle lines like we had in the first book. This is not Atreides versus Harkonnen. This is not Yorks versus Lancasters, Lannisters and Starks, however you want to play with the Gryffindor, Slytherin, whatever you want to do.
Sure.
It's not that simple anymore, and that's why I use that example of recreating one heresy within another family.
That's pretty cool.
You're expanding that condemnation.
And then it also, I think, still taps into the cyclical thing.
Yes.
Like that inevitability, but without making it predictable. I like that a lot. That's reminding me a lot of, this is maybe a silly example, but the way the Harry Potter books work, there's a lot of mirroring between specific books that sort of like acts as like imagine like a square that's shrinking inward. So like books 1 and 7 have a lot of correlations. Books 2 and 6 have a lot, and then 3 and 5, and then 4 is just its own thing.
4 is the centerpiece.
That's the centerpiece. That's the turning point. That's Voldemort coming back, right? That's Harry really having to go through trauma and grow up. So it's but like that like implies like the cyclical nature of things like corruptive power and grief and, you know, heroism. There's a lot in there about the next generation, right? You talk about Harry's parents and that generation of the Order of the Phoenix, and then like Harry's generation becoming the new, like, so there's a lot of that similarity in structure and echoing is happening there, obviously in a very different way. But I like that this is happening here too, because in the Harry Potter version, things don't feel predictable. I mean, there are predictable elements of, well, at the end of the school year, something big is going to happen with Voldemort. But other than that, like those echoes don't create predictability, but rather they just invite reflection about connections and cycles and that sort of thing.
And by the end of both of those series, I think everyone is sort of stained or sullied. Everyone is somewhat implicit.
Sure. Yeah.
Whether it's just by ignoring it and sort of whistling past the graveyard, or somehow participating in it. I mean, you look at the way Draco's father goes from like, I'm a bad guy because I used to be a bad boy. And then eventually it's like, oh no, the Nazis are back and I answer the call. And then you see the sort of listless regret and displacement at the end of the series.
Yeah.
You see that evolution within characters. I think there's a lot of that here because Herbert is so good at reshuffling roles and changing where people sit within that royal court. By the end of it, everyone has some sort of complicity, and you see that it's not just, okay, the Atreides are good, we like them, Harkonnen's bad. All of it is just power and rot.
Cool.
And you get these shocking alliances across family lines here that I wish I could spoil.
Okay.
You get some betrayals that you're not expecting. It's all crisscrossing time and space. Children of Dune feels like a wind-up toy. You've got these little subtle twists and then these cacophonous echoes throughout the book. I like the Harry Potter comparison. I think there's an intense interest in echoes, payoffs, twists, restaging and reframing. There is that sequence of history that collapses in on the fourth book. I like that. And I almost more enjoy what's happening in Dune, recency bias, because I haven't read the whole thing.
Sure.
So I don't know the final shape yet.
Right. You don't know how it's all going to come together. Yeah.
But to go a little further with that last point, I want to explore what felt like a recurring feeling throughout Children of Dune, where it felt like graduation day.
Okay.
Because I was watching these characters move up maybe the generational ladder, move up within this power infrastructure of the Imperium, and reaching that sort of entrenched, established status that so many people had in the first book when we met them. Characters like Baron Harkonnen, characters like Leto Atreides, or the Emperor, they were already set up by the time we met them. Here we're seeing some characters that we met when they were quote-unquote innocents, and now they're reaching that position. We see how they got there, the compromises they had to make to get there, and it makes us retroactively question some of those people we took at face value when we met them in Dune.
That's the baby Hitler question. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
How dare you? About Oscar Isaac? Yes, exactly. But like, listen to this chapter opener. It's a quote, and I love how on the nose Herbert gets in some of these critiques. Chapter opener from the Bene Gesserit training manual called Politics as Repeat Phenomenon.
Incredible.
Here's a quote.
Okay.
Governments, if they endure, always tend increasingly towards aristocratic forms. No government in history has been known to evade this pattern. And as the aristocracy develops, government tends more and more to act exclusively in the interests of the ruling class, whether that class be hereditary royalty, oligarchs of financial empires, or entrenched bureaucracy.
Wow. Is Frank Herbert American?
Yes. Of course he is.
Okay.
Like George R. R. Martin, the most incisive genre fiction writers are American.
Interesting.
He has this glorious, ever-diminishing interest in subtlety. That meme of, like, I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards.
Yeah.
But I love that we're feeling, again, that real-time work of history. We're seeing those characters we used to love and find sympathy in. We're seeing them elevate through the ranks. We're watching them calcify. And when you zoom out and look at one of these books as a whole, when I try to zoom out and look at all 3 of these first books as a whole, Herbert is pulling off this glacial magic trick where it's impossible to, I mean, it's sort of like you don't notice your hair getting longer until you see a picture of it.
Yeah.
Like day by day, you don't notice it.
Yes, right.
It's impossible to pin down in any one moment, but it's obvious in these sort of pinprick moments of reflection. Because he's never that explicit in the narrative. But when he drops a funky little quote at the beginning of a chapter and then just lets you run loose with it, lets it fester in the corner of your brain, it's admirable restraint.
I
think
that.
It pays dividends for me.
I feel like he's getting to kind of check off 2 boxes there. He's getting to kind of get his points out there without it like being totally in your face and without it disrupting the narrative.
Also, again, it's rooted in character because the Bene Gesserit are saying that. Like that teaches you more about those characters. It makes you more skeptical of them.
It's not just him sharing his political opinion about the nature of governmental power.
Exactly.
It's really rooted in how the Bene Gesserit view it, and it explains why they do what they do. So I like that.
It's just this foresight, I think, within the writing of this book. He talks about, I mean, if you look at the release dates, you see the years in between some of these novels. And he spent, I think, 6 years researching and compiling all of this before writing the first book.
Sure, yeah.
Like 6 years of like pre-production before that one.
Previs.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Children of Dune is still feeling the benefits of that planning because one of the last points I want to play with here is just that closing this book, it feels remarkably planned and intricate.
Cool.
Like we're pulling at some plot threads set up multiple books ago. We're assembling these new conspiracies and paying off these little pinpricks and, oh yeah, where did that go? Oh God, there he is. Like some of that is coming back in a way that feels very planned.
Cool.
It doesn't feel like he's just seeing what pieces are still on the board and sort of shaping them into a leftover sort of plot like you talked about the new Star Wars projects.
Yeah.
It's not like that at all. And I think part of that is that he's not precious about his characters. For those of you who've read the books out there, I will make a joke just for you. Frank Herbert is more precious than anyone in human history about one character. One character in particular.
Okay.
And Maggie, you will find out who that is in the next movie.
I'm very excited.
But for everyone else, he's willing to just toss people aside, even when they're fascinating and there's more to the story.
That's great.
Like, it's no one's narrative prominence is guaranteed or permanent. This is a different form of fearlessness, I think, than what we talk about in Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead. Where, I thought that guy was set. Oh, there he's beheaded.
Yeah, he's dead. Yeah, no plot armor. Yeah.
Or the sort of ship of Theseus that happens throughout The Walking Dead, where by season 7, it's like, none of these people were in the pilot.
Yeah, right. Except for Daryl, who's sometimes there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they fuck off to their own little spinoff. But
yeah.
This idea of shocking deaths and disposable leads that we really admired in those shows at the time, I'm finding something different within this series where it's about who gets Herbert's attention, who gets prominence within this larger history that's being constructed through these books. They don't read like a history, but that's very much the approach that Herbert is taking here. And sometimes when someone gets like roped back into the story, they've been busy the whole time they were off page, right?
Nice. Yeah,
they
of
were
course.
working on something big that now slots right back into the story where you'd need to.
Wow.
In the
nice.
same way that a history textbook doesn't tell you what someone's up to in their downtime. They mention them again when they do something worthwhile,
right,
or relevant.
That's noteworthy. Yeah.
And that sort of almost unemotional relationship with characters, I feel like Herbert is bringing to this story, where if they're not relevant, they're not on the page.
And that seems like something he's been doing for this whole series. I think it was in our Dune Messiah episode where we talked a lot about history and historical figures and like bringing in references to real like planet Earth historical figures in his books to sort of cement his story as part of larger world history. So that's pretty cool.
People don't linger unnecessarily. It's pretty cutthroat. It almost speaks to a talent of editing. Yeah. That's almost what it feels like.
Well, and this like really like highly planned and plotted and crafted world you're describing, or series you're describing, is really attractive to me. I like when everything feels planned and intentional and necessary, and not just like, I'll fuck around with this character for a while and see what happens. Like I like a predetermined plot. I like this idea of the author as this chess master. I think that's much more interesting to me.
Yes.
Even if it's not actually what happened, you can still make it like, maybe Frank Herbert didn't sit down and plan out his entire story in every detail and every character thread, but at least making it come together in a way that feels planned. Like in the way that they use the what's the rice poison in in Breaking Bad?
Yes.
Like they ricin. Yes, that's what it's called. I know
poison.
It's not rice, but I was thinking of Jesse going rice and beans. Ricin. They didn't know what to do with that. Remember, it's like in the wall, and they like had the hardest time figuring out how to bring that back. And then like the way that they did it, I don't remember what happens, but I remember it feeling so beautifully pre-planned and pre-plotted.
Yeah, when he hides it behind the electrical socket.
Yes, yeah. And it wasn't, but it felt like it, and that's what mattered to me. So that's what I'm getting at, and I like that this is how this series reads.
Yes, and that series worked well for the same reason that Dune works well. I think it's because you condition the audience to expect these things. So it's not jarring when characters are just out of the picture, when they're not relevant to the immediate plot.
Yeah.
I talked about this.
Kind of trust the author to bring him back at the right moment. Yeah.
Exactly. It's about trust. I think it's us trusting the author and them trusting us back.
To keep up. Yeah.
Because the previous books have conditioned us properly for this. I in our discussion of the movie, I called this Herbert's revolving door characterizations.
Yes.
And I was sort of flagging the movie's not doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So the weird stuff and all the changes and refreshes that are going to come,
it's going to be tough.
It's going to feel really jarring and upsetting when it does happen, but it happens so continuously and fluidly in the books that you're never affronted by any of these shifts.
It's because it's what you expect.
And you're excited when people come back because you know there's a reason. The last thing I want to talk about here is a follow-up to our last episode. And this is something I tried to kind of tiptoe around because I didn't want to spoil anything, and I still won't, although it was much more difficult this time. Last time I played with the concept of the Ghola, which was an escalation of the idea of echoes or ghosts in the way that you and I discuss these things in storytelling. Herbert is committing so much harder to that idea. And I don't mean there are more Gholas. I mean, he is pushing that interest in ghosts and echoes so much further in this book that he's shooting past the Ghola concept of Messiah almost into things that you and I like in horror movies. We're getting almost into the realm of reincarnation, or here's another quote, the terrors of possession.
Oh, cool.
So again, we're bringing it to that highest, almost theological point in how we're playing with this. There's discussion throughout this book of, quote, the desert demon. There are rumors of the undead. It becomes this haunted, almost horror-tinged, explicit version of what we loved in Sapkowski writing the Witcher series, where he would have this arm's-length character who wasn't in the chapter and maybe wasn't even named, but was very much the in absentia fascination of that chapter. We're doing that here with almost whole books at certain points with some of these new concepts that I can't tell you about. I guess one example I can say, there's a character called the Preacher.
Okay.
And there's so much in-narrative speculation and fear and theorizing about who that person really is. That becomes maybe an easier handhold for we're having a character in absentia here who we're thinking and talking about, and we've got this spectral, possible, unconfirmed version of them. And that, it's almost like the Ghost of Banquo. You have that thing in the room with you to keep it in the conversation, to keep that presence alive. Herbert's weaponizing those narrative tools in the same way Sapkowski does, but maybe even more viciously. Here's a quote I thought you'd enjoy.
Okay.
We kept the presence of death a dominant specter among the living here. By that presence, the dead changed the living.
Huh.
That feels like it's talking about that trend we noticed in Sapkowski. We kept the presence of death a dominant specter among the living here. By that presence, the dead changed the living.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying.
And I think every successive book that I've read in this series feels... It doesn't just better the series, it has this exponential effect where it compounds the previous books. It strengthens, they deepen one another.
Oh, that's awesome.
To the point where I rattled off all those similarities of like, these plot beats happen in Dune and they also happen in Children of Dune. You could do that with Dune Messiah as well. But then there are moments where it feels like the whole arc of those books is that in absentia, arm's length, point of fascination.
Cool.
And that feels, again, like he's playing with echoes and ghosts and Gholas and all of demons and possessions and all of these ideas that serve the same basic concepts.
That's really, really cool.
And here's where I sort of want to leave off as I look to the future.
Yeah, okay.
The next book is God, Emperor of Dune.
Uh-huh.
I only know a little bit, like the stuff you'd read in the blurb on the back of the paperback there.
Yeah.
I loosely expect God, Emperor to be another big swing.
Yeah.
I think if we're looking at sort of patterns and sequences within Herbert's series here, I expect God Emperor to be closer to Messiah.
Okay.
Because this one, plot-wise, felt so similar to the first Dune book.
Okay,
I expect this to be sort of the Messiah equivalent if that's going to be like a 2-book cycle.
Pattern. Okay, yeah.
Also, we have 6 books overall.
I was going to ask how many Frank Herbert wrote versus his son wrote 1 million. Okay.
But again, if he died before he could finish it, then maybe you can't call that intentional yet.
Sure.
But I know there's another time jump. I believe this is the big one, the like couple thousand-year time jump.
Okay.
But also the title is explicitly religious in the same way Messiah was.
Sure.
And I'm thinking, based on who the God Emperor is, there's going to be some more philosophy. There is a lot of like plot, exciting teases and twists at the end of Children of Dune that I want to see play out. But I'm almost most excited for the way that the next book is going to fold back on the others. Because that's my main takeaway from Children of Dune. It furthered these plots and characters so much. It was such a roller coaster. It was so provocative. But it also impossibly enriched the previous 2 stories.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
And now, because I have another book.
What more could we do? Yeah.
Right, but I'm also expecting it to enrich now 3 books.
Right, yeah. Very cool.
It makes each new sequel an increasingly impossible proposition for a writer.
That's an interesting like visual thing to try to put in your brain.
Right.
Yeah.
But it also means that my opinion of Frank Herbert improves with every new book.
Yeah, I mean that's so amazing to be able to do that.
He is a rare, awe-inspiring generational talent. And going into the next book, I'm so happy to have no predictions.
Yeah,
I have no idea.
Fun.
I'm just excited to see what he does next.
Do you know how long it is compared to the others? Or is it pretty like
around the same length as this one?
Okay.
I believe.
Okay.
And then I hear that things get really kooky for the last 2.
You said that they've been getting really weird since Messiah. So
every, I mean, I told you this when I was reading. It was like we started a new chapter, and it was just, what if I made weird tigers?
Yeah, you
and it was 3 or 4 pages of explaining the weird tigers.
So funny.
Like it all works and it's all relevant, but yes, increasingly weird.
Gonna get weird. I love
and
that.
Those are all spoilers, but rest assured. Weird stuff on every page.
Well, remember these are written in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, it was a more fearless time.
It was a fun time. All kinds of things were happening. Great. Well, that's so much fun.
The publisher would burn down his house if he was trying to write this in 2024. You couldn't. It just wouldn't be allowed.
Yeah,
it's the same reason all of the dangerous or provocative edges are shaved off every mainstream story now.
Yeah.
It's why things feel so toothless.
Yes.
And if nothing else, like a sandworm, Frank Herbert has teeth.
So there are plenty of sandworms in this book too, right? The sandworms we're not losing those. They
in
don't
ways
get boring.
you cannot possibly imagine, yes.
I think I know about one way that a sandworm is used, but I won't say anything in case it ruins it for somebody else.
You saw an old book cover from the 70s,
I've
which
seen,
sort of spoiled it.
It kind of does, but
yes. Lots of words.
It also makes me think, okay, how could they do that in a way that actually works? Because looking at that, it's not working for me. Okay, awesome.
It works, weirdly.
That's really awesome.
Yeah, loved it.
Awesome.
Very excited.
Well, this has been fun. I'm so glad you're enjoying this series, and I can't wait to hear how much weirder things are going to get, although
too.
it's going to be tough if you can't spoil things for me. I mean, at this point, I'm not going to catch up to you ever before you finish this series. I am going to read it, at least the first one, and I am currently reading the first one. But
do you feel differently about like our little spoiler policy? If the next book, I think it's a 3,500 year time jump.
Well,
what's our policy there?
Well, I don't know, because how much will it impact how much is it reliant on what happens in the previous books?
I don't know.
Well, yeah, I guess you don't know either. Well, I guess we'll just have to reconvene when you read it and we'll decide what to do there. But, well, great. If y'all, what do y'all think about this book? Have you read it? What did you think? Do things get any weirder? What do you think about all the stuff we talked about? We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can leave those in YouTube comments, send us an email, all that stuff.
Substack comments. Oh, no.
Ooh.
Patreon.
What is it?
Oof.
March
2023. Some people think this is like a return to form for people who thought Messiah was too weird.
Oh, okay.
Some people think this one's really tough to get through in the beginning of the end, and they don't even like God Emperor. What do you think?
Yes.
Tag your spoilers. Feel free to spoil whatever you want, but just tag it at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I'll read through those and reply to them. I'm fine. I'll deal with it. But I want to keep Maggie unsullied until she gets to the point of reading the books herself.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this journey, devouring Dune. These books are increasingly long and difficult, so we're not going to hit the same cadence of weekly for the rest of the books, but
probably not.
At this point, I'm sort of pot committed to covering the rest of
these novels. It'll happen. It's going to be great. If you like us talking about books, we also talk about Game of Thrones every single Friday. We are reading the books and talking about one chapter per week. We are, 15 chapters or so into Game of Thrones, the first book. So that's been really fun. So check it out over there. We've got a playlist. If you're on YouTube, we've got a playlist for all of our Dune episodes and a playlist for all of our Game of Thrones episodes. So you can
House of the Dragon.
Yeah, House of the Dragon.
All sorts of stuff.
All of our Summerween stuff. We have lots of playlists. I had a fun little day and I made a million playlists on our channel.
A YouTube commenter was like, "Can you please organize this?"
And I was like, "Yeah, so sorry." Especially because there's not like chapter 1 in Game of Thrones.
No.
It's just Catelyn or John, and it's like, okay. So yeah, we made a playlist. You're welcome.
Yep, and we already did the plugs, but if you want to hear our thoughts on the David Lynch Dune movie and us talking about the state of reading across its different formats and compromises in 2024, all of that is over on Patreon. $2 a month gets you the whole back catalog. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode. Thank you, Maggie, for returning to Arrakis with me.
Thank you for carrying me on this journey and deftly weaving and talking about all the things without spoiling a single thing.
I'm the worm. And you have gigantic hooks buried in my back.
I sure do. All right.
We'll see you on Friday for a brand new episode. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Bye.